are leaders in the world who are made for impact.
Coaching into excellent leadership is about identifying and becoming very familiar with your strengths and letting go of the ones that aren't your strengths, right? There's a huge difference between what am I actually good at, what I wish I was good at. And if I can sort of zero in on my real talent here and double down on that and stop worrying about the B's and the C's, right? And somehow find a way to delegate those or make them irrelevant, then I can double down on things where I'm already getting an A and make that an A plus.
I'm Gretchen Schott, and this is Made for Impact, a show for leaders who want to leave a lasting impact on their organizations, their teams, and their lives. My guest today is Tom Girard. He spent 15 years between San Francisco and New York in leadership roles in both startup and corporate retail environments. He served as brand president of Best Made Company, a menswear and home brand where he led teams across e-commerce, brand marketing, creative, product, design, and merchandising. Prior to joining Best Made, he spent a decade in corporate leadership roles at J.Crew and Banana Republic. Although he had a promising and successful career, he made a radical change and became a certified professional coach. Tom and I dig into his coaching style and how our beliefs can distort the truth of our greatness. Take a listen. Tom, I'm so grateful you're here. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
I would love for you to share a little bit with our audience about your leadership journey and then how you came to be an executive coach. Because when I learned about you and we met, I was like, wow, like this is a career. Like, let's talk about this for a minute. So share with some of our listeners a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I started my career right after college in the fashion and retail world. And I began my career at Gap Inc. and went through their executive training program called the Retail Management Program, and was placed in a headquarters role in merchandising for the Banana Republic brand directly after that. The program was maybe a year long. And I think when we connected, I shared with you that I never really intended for that to be where I started my career. I think I got a call randomly from a recruiter saying, "Are you still interested in this program?" And I was like, "I never applied to that program." My mother at the time was like, "You get in there and you take that interview. Like, you are crazy not to get the experience of interviewing." And one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. And I think like 5 or 6 interviews later, I got this program and I just sort of launched my career that way. I had no real sense for where it was going to go. And I spent 8 years at Gap Inc. And then later, I think at the end of my tenure there, I was leading about half the men's business for Banana Republic. And then I moved east to New York and was at J.Crew for a couple of years and managed about half of their men's business. And then was really enticed by the startup world and joined a really early stage menswear home startup called Best Made Company and helped grow that and do a capital raise. And we were eventually acquired and built the business. And I stepped into a brand president role. And I think at a certain point, I was in my mid 30s and I was like, eating and breathing stress. And I really needed a coach. And I had an enormous role in a really rapidly growing team in business and a lot of pressure with the board. And we were owned by a venture-backed huge startup in Silicon Valley and the biotech space. And they had their own board. And so there's just lots of pressure. And that's when I met my first coach right on time. And it was a really transformative relationship for me. And I was able to see, I think for the first time, a lot of the patterns that had ruled me throughout my career and had sort of deep roots in terms of how I viewed myself, where I had some distorted views of myself, distorted views of other people, distorted views of the expectations that were placed on me and what was real, what wasn't. Seeing these things clearly for the first time was transformative for me as a leader. And I was able to sort of shape for the first time and be on my front foot, like, who do I want to be? Not just in this career, but in this world. And I think all leaders deal with some element of this to varying degrees, but I had very somewhat distorted views of who I was or what was needed from me, or especially in a brand president role, I felt like I needed to be an expert in absolutely everything, which would be and is impossible for anyone. And so I think having a coach really helped me get to the bottom of some of these just base insecurities and distorted beliefs about myself in the world. And it was really, really transformative for me. And it sort of shined a light on the agency that I have to create the kind of career that I want that's built on my strengths. And so this is a long way of saying, that's what I want to do. I'm good at that. that's kind of what I realized, what I loved about work, about leadership, was helping shape people on their own terms and help people become the best versions of themselves. And so I made a big leap back in 2019 and left a very satisfying leadership career to become a full-time coach. That's what I do now.
I don't know if I told you this before when we talked. I used to work at Victoria's Secret.
Oh, no, you didn't tell me that.
I
No,
did. Yeah. And the same
wow.
kind of way, like I went and worked there just in between, like after college, and trying to figure out like what I wanted to do. And I was being groomed into that district manager type of role. And so, although I really loved retail, I was one of those people that like, I got excited to work on like Black Friday because I loved the craziness and the chaos and like all the people and like making people happy and like making their day, like all of that stuff. I love that. But I really love what you said too about those distorted views. I remember like in school studying leadership, in my graduate program and even in my undergrad. And the way in which we talked about leadership from a very theoretical approach is good. And there's definitely a great foundation in that. But then I would read these things and I'd go out and have these roles and these jobs where I would be given management opportunities. And it was so much different than what my professors had been telling me. I also can relate to that, having that, I wanted to have the leadership style that I read about in that book. I wanted to be like that leader because I read it. It's just going to like, that's how I'm just going to do that. And there's so much more behavior and people don't behave the way in which you anticipated. And they don't really always write about that when you're studying leadership. They talk more about you, not necessarily how to manage others. And that for me, I think took a long time. I ate on stress for a lot of years, especially being a working mother and doing all that, raising a family. That what you just said really resonated with me.
For a lot of the leaders I work with, there's an unlock that the best leader they can be, and this sounds so obvious and it's actually quite complicated in practice, but the best leader they can be is themselves, right? Like is who they are, right? And it's about the process of sort of coaching into excellent leadership is about identifying and becoming very familiar with your strengths and letting go of the ones that aren't your strengths, right? There's a huge difference between what am I actually good at, what I wish I was good at. And if I can sort of zero in on my real talent here and double down on that and stop worrying about the B's and the C's, right? And somehow find a way to delegate those or make them irrelevant, right? And then I can double down on things where I'm already getting an A and make that an A plus. That can sometimes be a really challenging transition for folks.
I think because I know you're a certified coach and you've gotten multiple certifications, you've been practicing as a coach for a while now. How do you define coaching and what distinguishes it from other forms of guidance or leadership?
So at the most basic level, I see coaching as a partnership between coach and client, partnership of equals. And that's really important, right? That's designed to clarify the client's goals, professional goals, obviously, but also personal goals, wide lens goals around what fulfillment means. And then from that place of clarity, develop action strategies that allow the client to achieve whatever that success is. So there's really two components to that. There's clarity and action. And I see sort of the coach's role as sort of a expansive, divergent, creative partner to think about like, what does success really mean to you on your own terms? Who are you? What do you value? What are your strengths? How do you get in your own way? Right. And then developing that clarity and converging around, well, what are the right actions to move this forward in a way that really fulfills what you want? So I think that your question around how is that coaching different from guidance is that what I care about is we're getting to the right answers for you. And so my primary responsibility is around creating an open space where you can really explore what's true for you. And I can reflect that back to you as your mirror. And I can say, I'm noticing this theme. It keeps coming up. It seems so important to you. Or like every time you talk about this, your shoulders collapse. There's something there is not working for you, right? And I can help you through that process of clarifying what's really important to you and then help and encourage you, right? Or challenge you to step into that from an action perspective. So I don't have like a preconceived notion of here are some answers that can be good for you, or here are the tips and tricks that work for everybody else, right? Because that can be actually very harmful in a coaching relationship. And sometimes guidance is that, right? Which is like, let me teach you something. Let me tell you what works for other people. Let me tell you what I think the answer is. And that stuff is important too, but it's not really what coaching is.
I think you'd agree. I love what you said about partnership is equals. I think that's super important.
Yeah.
And when I'm working with managers, especially first-time managers, they often believe they are coaching, when they are telling their employees what to do. So they'll be in, right? They believe that they're coaching because they're telling them, well, this is how I would do it. And they might ask one question like, well, why did you do it that way? Well, you could do it, this, and then they kind of stopped and they get into this telling. And I think sometimes it's that they don't always see themselves as equals because I've worked really hard. I'm the manager now. Like I worked really hard to get here, right? I'm high achieving, high growth. I want to grow my career. I want to be somebody. I want to be something. And so they elevate themselves. And in that elevation, they forget to, when they're in relationship with someone, that you have to take away that elevation of self and serve another.
Yeah. Hierarchical relationships have a purpose, right? And they can be highly effective. But when we talk about like influencing relationships, what I think about in terms of what influence is, it's creating change without forcing it, right? It's inspiring change. And I think the most foundational, most important part of inspiring change is creating some form of psychological safety. This isn't because I'm your boss or I'm your parent that you have to do this thing. I have a control over you or I have power over you. It's that I'm here for you in service to you, right? And we are equals in this. And oftentimes people say, well, how do you really sort of have an inspiring coaching conversation? I think it might be boring, but the first and most important thing is like creating trust, right? Creating a great relationship. It's 90% of it right there.
Well, it might be boring for the coach because we're just listening and we might be saying something back that person has said, kind of like holding up that mirror and saying, I heard you say this. Is that what you mean? Like just having that same kind of dialogue to just encourage them to get to that answer, because everyone has that answer within inside them. I think as coaches, it's us, it's our gift that we can bring that out in others. And if you don't like listening to people and hearing their story and having them say the same, wrestle with that same thing over and over and over again, you're probably not going to be a great coach, because sometimes we have to say the same thing to ourselves multiple times before we get it.
Yeah. Well, there's in business, I think about being a business leader, like an operational leader. And we used to have a saying when we were sort of moving into a much more data-driven approach around business, which is clearly important, is that if something's not measurable, it's not manageable. And that's so true in business. And I think there's an allegory in coaching, which is if something is not overt, it's not manageable. If we can't put something to language, if we can't name it, if we can't call it something, if we don't speak it, it doesn't exist. It remains covert and therefore out of reach. And so there's something about a coaching relationship. One power of the coaching relationship is being a mirror and saying back the thing that is true and allowing the coachee to say, sometimes, to your point, multiple times, what's true or what they're experiencing. And once it can be sort of spoken and shared in this sort of relationship, but now we can make change around it, right? Now it exists.
One of my favorite coaching tips, that one of my strategies I do with a lot of my clients, is when they're in that place of like, they're not being clear, I immediately kind of go to, let's talk about the emotion and let's talk about what emotion are we feeling? What emotion are you experiencing right now? And really getting them to be clear on, are you really angry? Is it angry that you're feeling? Or is it disappointed, right? Or is it shame? Or is it something else? Like really trying to help them identify. We have many emotions, and I believe like God gave us all the emotions so that we get experience all of them. He didn't just want us to be happy and mad or sad, right? He gave us all of those. For you, what's one of your go-to strategies to kind of help leaders who might be stuck or maybe ruminating on something? What's one of the things that you like to do with leaders?
What you're just speaking to around sort of asking what's happening at an emotional level is a version of widening the lens. And oftentimes what will happen is that our cognitive parts will sort of take over. I really want my boss to be the problem here, right? And I don't know that I want that, but that's what my brain is doing. And sometimes widening the lens in the way that you're speaking to, which is like, well, what is happening just purely at an emotional level? Or even sometimes we're really stuck. What are you noticing physically? And spending enough time there just to widen the lens around what is happening to a person holistically, right, can sometimes bring new information up. I feel powerless. Well, that's the coaching issue. We want to work on that. What are the beliefs that you hold around that support that kind of belief? It's less now if only that boss changes, and more about, well, this is a reproduced pattern of an issue that I face in multiple relationships and that I have some agency to be able to transform. So that's one way, I think, is looking at sort of different registers of knowledge, not just the cognitive sort of loop that we all get stuck in. I think there's something around where there's resistance, simply bringing language and naming resistance. And I think in addition to being a coach, also use parts work and in the internal family systems model. And it can be really helpful to say, okay, there's a part of you that really doesn't want to do this or be here or doesn't want to look at this. Like, what does that part of you want to say? Just giving voice to some of these various parts of ourselves can sometimes assuage concerns, loosen the resistance.
So what are strategies that you use to positively influence individuals when you're coaching them? Because I imagine some people come to you, and if I think about even your journey, you were stress ball, trying to be high achieving, want to grow this business, feeling all this pressure, and probably came in with like a lot of negative talk, a lot of negative perceptions about yourself. And as a coach, how do you then find ways in which to positively influence someone? And maybe it's more about how do you build trust with your clients? That might be a better way to look at that.
Well, I think that's the first part, right? Is building trust. And I think that's just about, first of all, being honest and genuine and asking, I am vulnerable too. And I try to be an open book. I don't make my coaching relationships about myself. They're about the client. But I think it's important that they understand that I'm also a human being, right? And that a lot of their struggles are struggles that people, including myself, have faced, right? And then also asking questions about themselves and expressing genuine curiosity that goes a really long way in terms of establishing trust. I think beyond that, it's funny. I don't know if you've ever read The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, Jim Dethmer and Diana Chapman. It's a really great leadership book. And in it, they reference a organizational change management strategy. And it's like an equation. And it's so dry. And I totally resist things like this, but I think it totally captures coaching. It's like, I think it's something like, change is, and this was written for organizations as opposed to individuals, but it was like, change is vision times disappointment plus first steps when greater than resistance, something like that. And it's like, some of these elements I think are really, really important to coaching, which is like vision. If we can sort of fuel vision and ask really big questions around like, if this goes really well, what do you imagine will happen? Or if everything were perfect, how would it be? Well, anything that sort of stokes an idea of unconstrained by today's realities, what would great look like for you? And cultivate that vision. That adds a lot of energy, right? There's a lot of just sort of spring potential energy that can get unlocked there. And then you want to compound that with like, well, what happens if nothing changes, right? What happens if you stay stuck here? And really get people in touch with, this is not working for me. I am stuck here. I do not like, this is not like I'm tolerating it, but if I actually go under the surface and experience the emotion of this and being prolonged the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, it's intolerable to me, right? And really you want people to experience that in their body. And once they do, the vision compounded by that sense of disappointment or that unease of not changing can really burst for energy of change. And you want to compare that also with first steps action. And all these things rely on each other. If you take a little step forward, it fuels my vision. It makes me less resistant, right? So that's, I think a lot of coaching is around just serving those elements.
Can you share a story or reflect maybe on a time when you had a moment where you really felt like you made a difference in someone's life as a coach?
I had a client, let's call her Emily, and I have her permission to share this. She, very, very high achieving, had been working in increasingly leadership roles in corporate finance for 20 years and came to me because she was clear that she wanted to leave sort of the corporate world and go embark in sort of entrepreneurial path and work for herself. Very clear about this. And so I remember our very first conversation, my role as a coach is to sort of help bring light to what are the core motivations behind some of those aspirations. What's really happening behind just being an entrepreneur, right? And so I remember asking questions that sort of stoked vision, like what makes you most excited about working for yourself? Or if that goes perfectly, what will happen? Or how will you change as a result? Or play it forward 20 years. And if you look back at that change, what will be important about that? And then also asking questions around why it was challenging. What made this hard? What is the biggest hurdle you face in changing this? Or where have you gotten stuck in this? And what I remember about that first conversation is that we got really clear about two things. One was that what she was really craving was a more spacious life where she could spend more time with her school-age daughter and honor values of hers around being highly present and being creative and have cultivating very close relationship with this child. And she saw self-employment as a path to that. And the second thing we got clear on is that she had this sort of perpetual pleasing pattern with her super bosses, one after the other, usually in the CEO capacity, to the extent that she was constantly overworking in this effort to meet expectations. Some of them were real expectations. Some of them weren't. Some of them were ones that she had sort of made up or assumed. And so I think it was really important for us to get there first. And I remember that we were able to sort of step back and say, this is the core desire. This is the core issue. If we sort of can step back here, we can ask ourselves, is self-employment actually, in fact, the path? Or is it possible that's just a new vehicle to perpetuate some of these same exact patterns? And so how do we start with the most important work first? And from that very first conversation, we decided, okay, self-employment, whether we do that or not, that's going to come second. We'll talk about that second or the third session. First, we're going to talk about this sort of pleasing pattern. And I remember from that point on, we really challenged the tough stuff. And we got to the root of what was making things so difficult for her, which was a chronic misaccounting for her talents and strengths, and which led to sort of an avoidance of confrontation and a desire to please. And once we were able to sort of transform that, then she was able to transform her relationship with her boss and ask for things she needed. She negotiated a 4-day work week. And she didn't have to change into an entrepreneurial path in order to achieve the things that she really wanted at the core. And that's not always the case for people. Sometimes their instinct around what they want is right on, and it's about supporting that. But I think this was an important relationship for me because it points to, I think, the power of coaching sometimes, which is to get to the real root of like, what is actually happening here? And what are all the different ways that we can address the solution?
I love that story. That's a great example. There's so many elements of that I just love that idea that, and I'm often, when I'm talking to people, I'm asking when they're wanting to make like a career change, are you running from, or are you running to something? And you kind of like broke that down. It was like, let's just pretend you are running to something, but let's talk about how we don't continue to have the same behaviors there in this pleasing, which I think so many people do that, and really getting it to the heart of like, what is it that you really need and what is it that you really want? And then having a conversation about how can you then perfect that present with where you're at? What needs to change? What would it look like if you were there and just perfected this and asked for some things that you believe you can get on your own if you do it on your own? But I do think that there is good growth mindset, growth opportunity that comes from an individual thinking about themselves as an entrepreneur. Like, what if I was doing this all by myself? And really kind of putting on that hat of like, what if it was all on me? And all those types of things, I think, help grow your own confidence and then advocating for yourself.
Absolutely. And I want to just sort of there's sort of two pieces there that feel so crucial to me. One is this idea of moving toward versus moving away. And I think it's such a crucial question to get extremely clear about what I'm moving toward. And any positive action is going to be a creative action that's moving towards something positive, right? As opposed to a reactive action moving away from something negative. And so I think that's a really, really, really important part of the process. And I think the second thing that you're pointing to is this sort of entrepreneurial mindset or growth mindset around agency. And I think this is where every coaching relationship seeks to secure this sense of responsibility and agency that the coachee has in shaping who they are and how they show up in the world. And the most radical act of that is getting clear on where am I my best, right? What do I need in terms of where am I best, and where am I my strongest, and what's the impact to drive when I'm strongest, and how do I then go shape my career and shape my life to serve those things. And that is always scary to do, I will say. I'll be as bold as to say that is always terrifying on some level to step into that.
Totally agree. What would you say are common, because you've been doing this a while, so like what are some common challenges you've encountered in the coaching process, and how do you overcome those?
I like to tell people at the very beginning of a coaching relationship that coaching is about change. That's what we're doing. We're making some sort of change, big or small, overt or covert. There's some change happening here. And change, especially big change, is, growth is pretty much always scary, right? And we'd say if like, we're not challenging, we're not changing. And so there is, I think, in any great coaching relationship, we encounter fear, and we encounter whether those are limiting beliefs about ourselves or about the world, or fears we've learned from events in our lives or from the perspectives of our influences, et cetera. And so there's always something, some challenge, and it's not always predictable what it is. I will say, I think 90% of working through those challenges, those fears of self-limiting beliefs, et cetera, are naming them, understanding and without judgment, without trying to, oftentimes we were working subconsciously or consciously so hard to bat our fears away, to not have them be present, not have them interfere, that we're sort of pushing them down and they just get louder and louder and louder and louder. And so if we can just name, oh, I'm on a podcast right now. It makes me nervous, right? I don't want to say something stupid. This is going to live out in the world. Like, that's my fear. It's sitting here. It's with me. And if I can allow it to be here, then it's okay. I can manage around it, or it can be my friend here. And if I'm just pushing it down, it's going to take over my body. And so I just think that becoming friends and familiar with our various obstacles and our fears is the only path forward, the integrator path forward to being able to maneuver through them.
How can one effectively balance that role of coach and mentor, do you think?
Because they're different, right? Coach is providing a lot of space for self-discovery and reflection for self-discovery and challenging into action based on what's right for you. And mentors oftentimes has a point of view or perspective, right? And an agenda sometimes too. So I think, and this is my refrain here through this conversation, is how do you make the covert overt, right? How do we just name the thing? And I think there's something very powerful about saying, hey, listen, in this conversation, I'm playing two roles. One of my roles is coach, and I don't have an opinion. I want to know what's best for you. And another role is like, I have an opinion and I have knowledge to share or wisdom to share or perspective, right, around what's going to happen. I'm going to name for you which hat I'm wearing in this conversation. And I oftentimes will do that and be like, listen, I want your permission to share it. And I'll just name, I'm taking my coaching hat off right now. And I just think if we can narrate the roles that we're playing, be really clear, I'm in a coaching role right now. That comes with certain expectations. I'm going to name what those are. And now I'm in an advisory role, right? Or a guidance role. I'm going to name what that is. And if we can kind of narrate which one we're maneuvering, it makes it a lot easier to have really spacious relationships that include all of these things.
If you were to look back on your career, what would you want people to say was the impact that you had in their careers?
I love that question. On a personal level, I will share with you my, this is going to be kind of a roundabout answer to you. I'll get to it, but there's a huge influence for me was my dad, who passed away 9 years ago. And he was a physician, and he took this radical stance that I think is actually quite radical in medicine today, that the most important part of his practice of medicine was the quality of his relationship with his patients, the emotional connection with his patients. They trusted him. They could go much further from a medical angle. And that was inspiring to me. I think one thing he was able to do was to see the strengths and the qualities of people when they were still quite nascent and unbeknownst to his patients. And I felt this as his child, right? That he could see in me powers I had well before I could. And I think all the power I have today that I wield today in my life and in my career, those are strengths that he recognized in me well before I did. And I hope that that is what I am able to do in my work and in my life, is to take the seedling of the mustard seed, as you will, and help to cultivate it and give it its space to grow into something huge and wonderful and bountiful that impacts other people downstream. I truly believe that we are not able to deploy strengths that we're not aware of. And once we can just bring awareness to them and recognize them and honor them and respect them, they can flourish and we can grow on top of them. And I hope I have some role in that.
If people are listening and they want to get in touch with you, they maybe want you to come on as a coach or get your advice or consultation, what's the best way for them to connect with you, Tom?
Well, I have a website. It is tom-girard, Girard.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Tom Girard. And yeah, I invite anyone to get in touch with me that thinks I could be of use to them.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sharing your wisdom on coaching. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
Oh, man, I feel so calm and good after talking with Tom. Don't you? Great voice, great advice. Just love that. I loved what he said about influence, and that is that we create change without forcing it. I love that. So good. So the question I have for you to ponder is, how are you evaluating your influence? I believe leadership is an influence relationship and management's an authority one, and both are important. But if you think of yourself as a leader, how are you defining that? And what role does influence play in that? Think about it and let me know. I'd love to hear. Hey, did you know that we're also on YouTube now? We are. So if you're interested in listening to this episode and seeing who my guest is, check us out on our YouTube channel. Go to www.youtube.com/@made4impact and subscribe. Until then, I want you to remember that you are made for impact.